The Duke of Caldwell had one rule. He would not be managed into a marriage. No house parties, no arranged introductions, no women who knew what he was worth before they knew his name. Then he said so out loud, in a library he thought was empty. It wasn't. The carriage from Hertfordshire arrived at Aldermere Park on a Friday afternoon in October at 3:30, in the company of two other carriages that had apparently had the same idea about timing. The Rutherford carriage was already in the drive when Nora's came through the gates. The Allertons pulled in behind. Aldermere itself emerged from the elm trees with the unhurried confidence of a house that had been there for a long time and expected to remain. Not ostentatious, the Pemfords were not ostentatious, but substantial in the way of houses whose warmth is structural rather than performed. The park rolled away to the south and east. The lake was visible between the trees, flat and pewter in the afternoon light. Nora Elwood stepped out of the carriage and looked at it and thought, good. She had been in a carriage since 9 o'clock and she was tired, and she had spent most of the journey composing a letter in her head to her father's solicitor that she would need to actually write before Thursday. She was glad to have arrived somewhere that looked like it had fireplaces. Clara Pemford appeared on the steps before Nora had reached them, which was characteristic. Clara's particular gift was appearing exactly when she was needed, with an expression that made you feel the occasion had been arranged specifically for your benefit. She took Nora's hands and looked at her with the warmth of a woman who had been waiting to do this since the invitation was accepted 3 weeks ago. "You look well," Clara said. "You look tired and well, which is the best combination." "I've been in a carriage since 9, Nora said. "Come inside, there's tea." Tea was a lively, crowded affair, which surprised Nora slightly. She'd expected the residential guests and perhaps a neighbour or two, but the drawing room held more than a dozen people, several of whom had the look of local families who had come for the afternoon rather than the fortnight. Clara moved through it all with the ease of a woman entirely in command of her house, making introductions at a pace that required Nora to pay close attention. The Rutherfords. Colonel Rutherford, tall and militarily upright, who had opinions about everything and expressed them with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously contradicted. Mrs. Rutherford, more observant than she appeared, 2 younger daughters, pleasant and tired from the journey, prepared to be charming once they had slept. The Allertons, Mr. Allerton, Hertfordshire accent, placing him within 15 miles of Nora's own village, with strong opinions about drainage that she filed as a potential evening's conversation. Mrs. Allerton, interested in window treatments, which was more interesting than it sounded once she got into it. Miss Stowe was already there, had apparently arrived the previous evening, which explained the particular composure of someone who had already survived the first 24 hours. She was 22 and pretty in the way that had recently stopped working in her favor, and she was engaged in a conversation with one of the neighboring families with the attentiveness of someone who was aware of being watched from another part of the room. Nora followed the direction of that awareness without appearing to, and found across the drawing room the Duke of Caldwell. She had heard his name in Clara's letters, 4 of them over the summer, each mentioning him with the specific frequency of a woman who was not yet saying something but was preparing to. She had heard it before that, in Hertfordshire drawing rooms, where the name Caldwell had been currency since before she was old enough to attend them. She knew the name. She knew the acreage roughly, the way anyone in the county knew such things, absorbed by proximity rather than inquiry. What she had not had was a face to put to any of it. The face was, she catalogued it without dwelling, dark-haired, well-made without being remarkable about it, the kind that wore its expressions with the same economy she would come to learn characterized all of him. He was speaking to one of the neighboring gentlemen with the ease of a man who had been coming to this house long enough to feel at home in it, and he was doing it while managing at the same time a quality of attention that she could only describe as rationing. He was present, he was attentive, and he was keeping something back, not withdrawing, rationing. She did not introduce herself. Clara was occupied. The drawing room was full, the tea was good, there was no reason to cross the room when she had just arrived and was still composing herself. She found a chair near the window, accepted a cup from the passing tray, and let the afternoon arrange itself around her. At 4 o'clock, Clara announced that the residential guests would be shown to their rooms at 5. The neighborhood families were staying for dinner and would not need to change, but those who had come some distance would want an hour. Nora counted the arithmetic, 1 hour before she needed to be anywhere. She looked at her tea, which she had finished. She looked at the drawing room, which was warm and full and required a particular quality of sustained cheerfulness that she was not certain she had in reserve. She had noticed on her arrival a door to the left of the fireplace that stood fractionally open. Beyond it was a corridor. Clara had mentioned the library on the way in. The library, Nora, you'll want to know where it is. And Nora had noted the location with the quiet gratitude of someone being handed a map to dry land. She set her cup on a passing tray. She went through the door. It was a good library. She had remembered this from her last visit, not the largest she had seen, but arranged with care rather than display. The volumes within reach rather than aloft, the chairs placed for reading rather than for being seen to read. The room was lit only by the corridor light and the last of the October afternoon through the windows, which was sufficient. She went to the third shelf, where the Virgil had been on her second visit and where it still was. She took it down. She settled into the window seat, pulled the curtain across without thinking, old habit, the instinct to make a small space inside a large one, and opened the book. She read 3 pages. She found herself thinking about the solicitor's letter instead. She let the book rest open on her knee and looked at the elm trees through the glass and considered whether the solicitor's suggestion was workable, which she was beginning to suspect it was not, which meant that her father's other suggestions would need to be returned to, which meant that the question of the autumn was not going to resolve itself, and the winter was going to require decisions she had been deferring since June. She had come to Aldermere to not think about this. She had been here for 40 minutes. She heard the library door open at 4:15. 2 sets of footsteps, one heavier, one lighter. She did not announce herself. The curtain was fully drawn now, she realized. She had drawn it all the way across without noticing, which was not what she had intended, and the window seat was a deep one. She was not visible from the door. She was not hiding. She had simply, in 40 minutes of accumulated distraction, made herself invisible by accident, and by the time she understood this, it was already too late to correct it gracefully. The footsteps crossed the rug, the sound of a decanter, the Duke's familiar hand with Pemford's crystal. "Not asking for your opinion on the matter," the first voice said, "and I don't care if it's Pemford's best brandy. I need it after that tea." "You never ask for my opinion." The second voice was easier, younger in quality, a friend, not a subordinate. "You merely tolerate it when I offer it, which amounts to the same thing with extra steps." Tolerate is generous. A pause, the sound of a glass set down. "She referred to my estate 3 times in 1/4 of an hour. 3 times, Farley. I was discussing the weather." "To be fair, your estate is—" "I am aware of what my estate is." A shorter pause. "I will not do it. Your mother—" "My mother may select her own husband if she finds the institution so essential." Farley made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's dramatic." "It's honest." The first voice had not changed register, still pleasant, still unhurried, and the irritation underneath it more visible for being contained. "There is a woman in that drawing room who has been coached to secure my attention and is executing those instructions with dedication. I will not reward the enterprise. There are other candidates. Clara has invited half the county. I do not intend to fix on anyone." A sound she couldn't place, a book reshelved or a handset flat on wood. "I find the entire enterprise insulting. The presumption that I can be managed into a decision by a carefully arranged tea table—" "You could have declined." "I could not have declined." The voice shifted, fractionally. Not softer, honesty reaching the surface. "Pemford is one of 6 men in England I actually trust, and his wife is a good woman who means well, and I am not going to wound either of them by refusing their house." A pause. "I simply intend to be unpersuadable." The distinction between unpersuadable and unpleasant is not always visible to the people in the room. "No," a concession made without remorse, "but it's visible to me." A silence in which she heard the decanter replaced on its surface. She had not moved. She was aware that she had left it too late about 60 seconds ago when she might have shifted or cleared her throat. She had not. She was committed now to a course she had not chosen, which was staying very still. "The families who came this afternoon," Farley said, his voice lightening, moving on from a conversation they had had some version of before. "The Rutherfords, the Allertons, and Clara's particular friend, a Miss Elwood. Been here twice before, apparently. She arrived with the others." "I'm sure they're all perfectly agreeable," said the first voice. The Duke, she was placing him now, the voice settling into the title. "The Duke of Caldwell, whose estate was somewhere to the northeast. who had spent a quarter of an hour discussing the weather with Miss Stowe. I would simply sooner marry a stranger. Farley said nothing for a moment. That is, the Duke continued, with the dry edge she was beginning to identify as characteristic, someone who has no reason to want anything from me specifically. Someone who has not been briefed. A pause. Someone who doesn't know the acreage. She looked at the Virgil in her lap, at the page she had not turned. She thought about the word stranger and what he had meant by it. Not someone unknown to the world, but someone unknown to his situation. Someone who had not been briefed on what he was worth. She was not that precisely. She knew the name Caldwell. She had heard it in Hertfordshire drawing rooms since she was 17. But she had not known the man, and she was beginning to think that was the distinction he had actually meant, even if it was not the distinction he had said. That is a remarkable standard, Farley said. It is a consistent one. The dry note sharpened slightly, not quite amusement. I am simply tired of being a mechanism. The conversation moved then somewhere easier. A wager in Bath, a horse that had been misrepresented. She stopped attending closely. She was looking at the elm trees through the glass, and she was thinking about the word mechanism and its uses and its relationship to a word she had used herself in her own head that same afternoon, on the subject of her father and his options and the autumn that was not resolving itself. The footsteps moved back toward the door. The door closed. The corridor swallowed their voices. She sat for a long time in the window seat with the Virgil in her lap, not reading it. Then she rose, straightened her dress, and replaced the book on the third shelf precisely where she had found it. She smoothed the cushion. She drew the curtain back to where it had been when she arrived. She went to the door, opened it enough to see the corridor, confirmed it was empty, and returned to the drawing room just as Clara began gathering the residential guests to show them to their rooms. It was 5 o'clock when Nora reached hers. She had an hour before she was expected back for the pre-dinner assembly. She spent 20 minutes writing the letter to the solicitor. It was clearer than anything she had managed in the carriage. Her mind had been occupied by other things since the library, and the occupation had, somehow, sharpened rather than distracted. The remaining time she used to wash her face, pin her hair and change into a dress that was good enough for a first evening without being the statement of a woman who had decided anything yet. She looked at herself in the glass and made the assessment she always made. Adequate. Tidier than the journey. She went downstairs. The drawing room had rearranged itself in the hour she had been absent. The neighborhood families who had come for the afternoon were still present, preparing to stay for dinner. The residential guests had returned, changed, and somewhat restored. The fire had been built up. The light was different, lower, warmer, the particular quality of a room settling toward evening. Clara appeared at Nora's elbow within 2 minutes of her entering, with the expression of a woman who has been watching for her. "There you are," Clara said. "I don't believe you were properly introduced to the Duke at tea. He has a habit of disappearing to the library the moment he arrives, but I have retrieved him for the evening." Nora kept her expression entirely pleasant. "Of course," she said. Clara did what Clara did. A light introduction. Her particular warmth applied to both parties simultaneously, a sentence or two, and then a step backward so smooth it might have been choreographed. It probably had been. The Duke of Caldwell looked at her. His expression was pleasant and gave her nothing. "Miss Elwood, Clara speaks of you often." "And of you," Nora said. "I had formed quite a thorough impression before this evening." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement. I hope it was not entirely accurate. That would depend on the impression. Indeed. His eyes were attentive in the specific way she had noted from across the drawing room, not performing attention, actually attending. "And what was yours?" She considered what she could honestly say and what she could not. That you were someone who found most social occasions mildly effortful, but had become very good at not showing it. He was quiet for exactly the right length of time. "I would not say that was entirely inaccurate," he said. "Then I hope I haven't made this one worse." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "Not yet," he said, and moved on when Colonel Rutherford appeared at his elbow with the determined look of a man who had been waiting for an opening. Nora watched him go. She found a chair near the fire and sat and thought about absolutely nothing for 3 minutes, which was its own kind of answer to a question she had not yet decided to ask. Clara Pemford had been Nora's closest friend since they were 14, and had been seated alphabetically adjacent at a tedious assembly in Hertfordshire. They had survived the assembly, 3 years of school, 2 London seasons, 1 broken engagement, Clara's, subsequently mended, and the slow divergence of lives that went different directions without losing what mattered between them. What mattered was this: Clara knew when Nora was managing something, and Nora knew when Clara was arranging something, and they had long since arrived at a mutual understanding in which both of these things were permitted to happen simultaneously, with full awareness and minimal comment. Which was why at breakfast the following morning, when Nora came downstairs and found the small table near the east window already occupied by the Allertons and inexplicably the Duke of Caldwell, she did not say anything to Clara about it when she passed her in the doorway. Clara gave her a look of absolute innocence. Nora gave her a look of absolute clarity. They understood each other perfectly, and neither said a word. The Duke was reading the newspaper when she sat down. He lowered it by a precise inch, registered her, and said, "Good morning, Miss Elwood," with the ease of a man extending an established acquaintance on the basis of a single dinner conversation, which was either very natural or very deliberate. She had the same problem with him that she had with Clara. Impossible to be certain which. "Good morning," she said, and reached for the coffee. The Allertons were deep in a conversation about their youngest daughter that required no additional input. The Duke returned to his newspaper. Nora spread butter on toast and looked at the kitchen garden beyond the window, where the autumn cabbages stood in their rows, with the patient look of things that had already decided what they were. "You were not here yesterday," he said without looking up. "I arrived yesterday afternoon," she said, "with the Rutherfords and the Allertons." He turned a page. "Clara said you'd been here before." "Twice." She glanced at him. "You ride over often, I understand." "Most weeks when I'm at Caldwell." He set the paper down, though not entirely. It rested at an angle that suggested he might return to it. "The Pemfords they are good company, and the library is better than mine." He said this as though it pained him slightly to admit, which she thought might have been the first genuinely unguarded thing he had said to her. "You admit that freely?" she asked. "I admit what's true. There's no use pretending otherwise about a library." He looked at her with an expression that was beginning to acquire its own particular character. Not warm, exactly, but attentive in a way that felt different from social attention. "You went in there yesterday before dinner." She kept her face entirely pleasant. "I wanted somewhere quiet after the journey." "Did you find it?" "For a while," she said, which was honest. He looked at her for a moment with the quality of a man who has asked a question and received an answer, and is not certain the answer is the whole of it, and has decided, for now, not to press. "Clara has strong opinions about seating arrangements," he said instead, glancing at the 4-chaired table and its current occupation. "She does," Nora agreed. "Do you mind?" She considered the question. "I've found that minding takes more energy than it returns." He considered this with the seriousness she was beginning to suspect he brought to most things. "That's either very wise or very tired." "Most wisdom is," she said. "Tired, that is. It's how it gets made." He looked at her, a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then returned to the newspaper. She finished her toast. Outside, the cabbages stood in their patient rows. The Allertons reached a conclusion about their daughter and moved on to the subject of a particularly anticipated jam the Rutherfords were said to be bringing. It was all in all a very ordinary breakfast. She was not sure why it required such careful management of her expression. The house party established its pattern within 48 hours. Mornings were loose, breakfast at various times, walks proposed and debated, the library and the sitting room occupied by people who had arranged themselves according to inclination. Afternoons tightened, rides for those who wanted them or cards, or the excursion to the folly at the far edge of the grounds that everyone agreed was charming and no one felt urgently about. Evenings were the formal business of it. Dinner, then the drawing room, then the gradual dispersal of people who had been agreeable for long enough. The Duke rode over 3 times in the first week, once for the afternoon, once for dinner, once for most of a day that blurred from a morning walk through luncheon and cards, and only resolved itself into departure around 6. Clara received him each time with the warmth of a woman who regarded him as family and the specific quality of someone who had arranged for him to be in the same room as a particular person and was monitoring the results. Nora watched the monitoring and said nothing. She was occupied with her own monitoring, which she was conducting with what she hoped was greater subtlety. He moved through the house party with an ease that was genuine rather than performed. She had been watching long enough now to be certain of this, He was good at people in the specific way of someone who was actually curious about whoever was in front of him when he chose to be, and who had learned at some cost when not to bother. He was patient with Colonel Rutherford, who repeated himself. He was attentive to Mrs. Hallerton's views on window treatments with an interest she was fairly certain was authentic, because Mrs. Allerton was unexpectedly interesting on the subject of window treatments, and he was a man who managed an estate. He was courteous to Miss Stowe in a way that was neither cold nor encouraging, a precise calibration that probably required more skill than it appeared to. He was funny sometimes in the way that requires attention to catch. She caught it. She was not performing for him. She had decided this somewhere between replacing the Virgil and sitting down to the first dinner, and found that the decision, once made, was neither difficult nor costly. She had nothing to perform. She was here for Clara, and for the rest from Hertfordshire and the solicitor's letters and her father's options, and she had her own absorptions, a novel she had been meaning to read for months, a particular walk along the north edge of the grounds she had discovered on her second morning and intended to make habitual. It was on this walk, 4 days in, that she encountered him for the first time without other company. He was coming from the direction of Caldwell, which made sense given that Caldwell sat roughly 3.5 miles to the northeast, close enough to ride over in under half an hour, far enough that the ride was a choice rather than an errand. He had the look of a man who walked when he needed to think rather than for the exercise of it, and she recognized the look because she had the same one. She could have taken the fork that led back to the house by a longer route. She did not take it because there was no reason to, and taking it would have been exactly the kind of management she had decided not to perform. "Miss Elwood, Your Grace." They fell into step without either of them proposing it. The path was wide enough for two people who were not trying to be close and not wide enough to pretend a comfortable distance. "You prefer the morning," he said. "Not a question." "I prefer it before other people are using it," she said. "That's not quite the same thing." "No," he glanced at her. "How do you find the North Walk?" "Quieter than the afternoon. The birds have finished making decisions by this hour." She kept her eyes on the path ahead. "It's more peaceful when the question is settled." He was quiet for a moment. "You find settled questions peaceful?" "Don't you?" He thought about it with the seriousness she had come to expect from him, a quality she found she actively anticipated after years of men who gave the surface answer. "Some questions, yes. Not all of them." "Which ones don't you?" He glanced at her again. She met it. "The ones," he said, "where I've been given the answer before I've had the chance to look." She understood him precisely. She also understood that he didn't know she understood him, which meant she could say nothing or say something oblique, and either was honest, but one was more honest than the other. "Those are the worst kind," she said. "Being told what you'll find before you've looked." "Yes," he paused. "It makes the looking feel performative." "Yes." He said it with a weight that suggested she had found the exact word, and this had surprised him. They walked for a moment in silence. The birch trees here were white-barked and half-bare, their leaves already down and composting into the path underfoot. "You read last night," he said, "after the Colonel's campaign stories." She had, in fact, been reading. Most of the room had not noticed. "It was a very extended recollection," she said. 4 campaigns, I counted. I got through 18 pages. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the smile, the thing before the smile which she had also begun to catalogue. "What were you reading?" This was not a question she had been prepared for. She considered the honest answer against the careful one, and chose the honest one because she had decided, and decisions were meant to be kept. "Don Quixote," she said. "I know that's perhaps not—" "Which translation?" She looked at him. "Smollett," she said. He was quiet for 2 steps. "Shelton is better," he said. "The Smollett is competent. The Shelton has the rhythm of the original." She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps and stopped as well, turning to look at her with an expression of genuine curiosity about whatever he was about to see. "You've read it," she said. "Twice." He said it without particular emphasis. "Once at Oxford, once last summer. It improves considerably when you're no longer being examined on it." She started walking again. He fell back into step. "Most men of your—" She stopped. "Of my what?" He wanted to know. No offense in it, only the same interest. She chose the honest version. "Most men of your position read what they're expected to read, and only well enough to mention it." "What am I expected to read?" Agricultural history, possibly Livy. She kept her voice level. Not Cervantes. Cervantes is extraordinary, he said, with the conviction of a man who had formed the opinion himself and was not interested in revising it. The scene with the barber and the basin alone is worth the whole first volume. The Smollett or the Shelton? The Shelton. He glanced at her with something that was not quite amusement and was more than interest. Obviously. She looked at the path ahead, at the bare birch trunks and the October sky beyond them, grey and still. She was aware of managing something in her expression, which was against her own rules, and she released it. "You're very unexpected," she said. "So I've been told." He said it without satisfaction and without modesty, which was its own kind of unexpected. Usually it's meant as a warning. "I don't mean it as a warning," she said. He looked at her. She met it. The path opened onto the north lawn and the house was visible at its far edge, Clara's drawing-room windows lit against the grey morning. "Then how do you mean it?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "As information," she said, "that I'm filing away." "For what purpose?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I find it's better to have it than not." He said nothing. They walked the rest of the way in a silence that had become something other than neutral, and she thought about what information was doing in that sentence and whether it was the right word, and could not immediately identify a better one. Farley sought her out on the fifth morning in the smaller sitting room where she had retreated to write the letter she had been composing in fragments since the carriage. He came in without apology and sat in the chair across from her with the ease of a man who had assessed her tolerance for being interrupted and found it acceptable. She set her pen down. "Clara says you've been here twice before," he said. "She's right." She looked at him. "And you've been coming for years." "Since we were 20. He settled more comfortably into the chair, which confirmed what she had suspected. A man entirely at home here. "He told me this morning you read Cervantes." "Did he?" He seemed animated by it. Farley said this with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a significant event. "He is not often animated before 11. She looked at her letter. "We had an interesting conversation." He said that as well. Farley was quiet for a moment. He had a quality she appreciated. He thought before he spoke, and what he said was what he meant. He said you were the first person he'd spoken to all week who wasn't trying to tell him something. She kept her expression steady. "I wasn't aware I had a choice in what I was trying to do." "You don't generally, that's rather the point." He tilted his head. "He's been looking for the angle for 5 days. Has he found one?" "No." Farley looked at her directly. "That's what's interesting to him. And I'll be honest with you, Miss Elwood, because I find honesty more efficient than its alternative. He's not often interested. Not in the specific way of actually looking at someone. He tends to look past people now." "Now," she said, "since 2 years ago." Farley looked at her. "What do you know about 2 years ago?" "Only that something happened. You told me without meaning to the first evening." She met his eyes. He trusted someone and it cost him. He's been running the same precaution ever since. Farley was quiet for a moment. He trusted a woman who turned out to have been managed, by her mother primarily. The whole thing had been arranged from the outside, and he had believed it was genuine, and when he discovered it was not, he stopped. He wasn't broken by it. Caldwell doesn't break easily, but he was insulted, which for him is in some ways worse. He paused. He stopped trusting his own read on people, which means he stopped letting people in long enough to be read. She thought about this, about a man who had learned that his judgment was fallible and had responded by applying it more carefully and less often, about the specific quality of his attention, which was real when he gave it, and rationed when he did not. "And he's applying it to me," she said. "He's trying to." Farley gave her a look that she thought probably meant something she would understand later. "He keeps finding nothing to apply it to." He stood, stretched, glanced at the door. "He notices more than he says, Miss Elwood. I thought you might want to know that." "I'll try not to give him anything worth noticing," she said. Farley gave her a look of such gently expressed skepticism that she felt it after he'd left the room. She picked up her pen. She did not immediately use it. It rained for 2 days, real October rain, the determined grey kind that had no interest in atmosphere and simply got on with being wet. The North Walk became a river. The Folly, which the party had been planning to visit all week, became an aspiration. The house, already full, turned inward. The drawing room held 14 people, and the various negotiations of a group that had been together long enough to have formed opinions about one another. The music room absorbed anyone with the ability or the tolerance for the pianoforte. The library became, by the second afternoon, the room where people went when they needed to not be in either of the above. Nora had been in the library for half an hour when she realized she was not alone. She had taken the chair by the fire this time, which she considered a sign of growth, and she had been reading with sufficient absorption to not hear him come in. She looked up to find the Duke in the window seat, with a book she couldn't see the title of, and an expression of someone who had been there for several minutes. They looked at each other across the room for a moment that was too brief to be awkward, and too present to be nothing. "You were here first," she said. Apparently we both were. He did not move from the window seat. She did not move from the fire. A negotiation occurred without words, in the way of two people who have been having oblique conversations for a week. "I didn't hear you come in," he said. "You were reading. What time did you arrive?" "About half an hour ago." She turned a page she had not finished, so he would not think she was flustered, and then immediately regretted it as the more obvious performance. "I can find somewhere else if—" "No." The word was direct without being urgent. "I've been here before when you weren't. It's your room as much as it's mine." He glanced at the shelf. "Less, technically. It's Pemford's." They read in silence. The rain moved against the windows in long sweeps. The fire settled and subsided. She turned pages she was actually reading now. He turned fewer, which suggested he read slowly, or was not reading, or was thinking about something that kept interrupting him. "What are you reading?" he asked eventually. She looked up. He was looking at her. "Cervantes," she said. "The Shelton." He almost smiled. "I stand corrected on your taste." "You impugned my translation, not my taste." She held his gaze. "That's different." "Fair." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the Shelton versus the Smollett since Tuesday." She looked at him. "Genuinely?" "I told you I think before I speak." He said it without vanity. "The Smollett is cleaner, actually. Better English prose. But the Shelton has the rhythm. Cervantes is a book about a man who has read too much. It needs a translation that sounds like too much reading." She set her book down. This happened with Cervantes. Someone said something interesting about it and the book had to wait. "That's very exact," she said. "Did you reach the sheep?" "The Battle of the Flocks, yes." She kept her voice level. "I found it devastating." He looked at her with something that was not the managed expression, and not the complicated one, but something else. Something plainer, with the quality of a man hearing something he had thought was only his own response, and discovering it wasn't. "So did I," he said. "The first time at Oxford, I didn't expect it. It's supposed to be comic." "It's both," he said. "That's the point. It's a comedy about a man who genuinely believes what he sees, and everyone else can see what he actually sees, and the gap between those two things is where the comedy and the devastation live together." He paused. "I find that particular gap." He stopped. "What?" she said. "Familiar," he said. She looked at him. He had not meant to say it. She could see that, the slight recalibration in his expression after the word came out. She could have let it go. "The gap between what you believe and what's actually there?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Yes." She thought about the library the first afternoon, the curtain drawn and the voice below and the word mechanism. She thought about the week of conversations and the angle he hadn't found and the question of why she had not announced herself. She was not going to tell him, but she could be honest about the adjacent thing. "I know that gap," she said, "though in my experience it runs the other direction. What's actually there turns out to be more than what I believed." He looked at her steadily. "More." "More interesting," she said. "More—" She paused. "More than the briefing suggested." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What briefing did you have?" "Clara's letters," she said. "She mentioned you rather often over the summer." "What did she say?" "That you were very good, and that the house party would be interesting." Nora kept her voice even. She was not wrong on either count, which I find is rarer than it should be with Clara's predictions. He looked at the fire, at the shelf, back at her with the clear version of his attention, unguarded, no portion held back. "And what did you think?" he said. "When you first—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "When you first encountered the reality rather than the briefing." She thought about the dinner. about the management of his expression across the table and the glimpse of what was behind it. "I thought you were more effortful than you were showing," she said, "and that the effort was for something worth protecting." She paused. "I thought you were keeping accounts." "Keeping accounts," he repeated. "Of what you gave and to whom?" She looked at him directly. "Most people don't bother. You do. That seemed worth noting." The fire settled. The rain ran down the glass. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence had the quality she had been noticing for a week. Not comfortable in the easy sense, but settled. The sort of silence that requires some trust to sustain. "You are," he said eventually, unexpectedly direct. "You said that on the morning walk." "I meant it more now." He did not look away. "Most people who are direct as a strategy. You're direct because evasion wastes your time." "And yours," she said. "And mine." He almost said something else. She could see it, the pause that preceded his careful sentences, and then he returned to his book. She returned to hers. They read for the better part of an hour in the warm library, while the rain did its thorough and indifferent work outside. At some point Clara opened the door. Nora heard it, did not look up, not immediately, and then looked up to find Clara in the doorway, taking in the two of them in their respective chairs with the fire between them, and the books in their laps, and the afternoon light going. Clara's expression moved through something rapid and arrived at satisfaction. She withdrew without speaking, and pulled the door almost entirely closed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "She means well," Nora said. "I know." He turned a page. "That is what makes it impossible to object to." The rain broke on the third morning, and Clara proposed the folly. The folly was agreed upon. 14 people distributed themselves into walking parties, the enthusiastic, the less enthusiastic, and Mrs. Allerton, who had decided the folly was within her capabilities and intended to demonstrate this. By an arrangement Nora had by now accepted as characteristic of this particular house party, she found herself in a group of 6 that included the Duke, Farley, Miss Stowe, the younger Miss Rutherford, and Mrs. Allerton. Miss Stowe came alongside Nora halfway across the grounds. She was 22 and pretty in the way that had recently stopped working in her favor, a knowledge that showed quietly around the eyes. She had been the designated candidate of the party since before it began, which was a position that required performing interest while receiving courtesy, and Nora had been watching this process with a sympathy she had not been asked to offer. "You and the Duke speak easily," Miss Stowe said. She said it without accusation, more like confirming something she had been observing. "We've had some conversations," Nora said. "He speaks to you as though you're ordinary." She said it as a compliment. "Not," she paused. "Everyone I know speaks to him as though he's a category. He seems to know it. It makes him careful." "He's careful," Nora agreed. "I think he would be less careful," Miss Stowe said, "if people would stop giving him reasons to be." She was quiet for a moment. They were crossing the south lawn, the folly visible at the tree line, the October light flat and golden on the grass. "I don't think this was ever going to work," she said. "He and I don't say that unhappily. I say it because I think it's true, and I find it more restful to say true things." Nora looked at her. There was more in her than a house party had given her room to show. "That seems like a reasonable policy," she said. Miss Stowe smiled, a real one, briefly. "Clara should have invited me for a different reason," she said. "Not for—" She gestured slightly toward the Duke ahead of them on the path. "For myself. I think I would have been better company for it." "You are good company," Nora said, and meant it. Miss Stowe looked at her with a directness that Nora recognized as its own kind of gift. "So are you," she said. "I've been watching him realize it all week. It's rather interesting to watch." Nora said nothing. They reached the folly, and the party dispersed between those who wanted the view and those who did not believe the view justified the climb. The view from the top was worth it. The grounds spread east and south, the park, the lake, the birch walk, the kitchen garden in its orderly rows. The house was visible from here in a way it wasn't from within it. The whole of it, properly proportioned, a house that had been there for a long time and looked like it. Farley had drifted to the far parapet with the younger Miss Rutherford, where he was pointing at something with the enthusiasm of a man who has arranged for someone else to have a moment and is filling his portion of it convincingly. Nora stood at the near parapet and looked at the grounds and waited to see if the Duke would speak. "So you can see the Caldwell home wood from here on a clear day," he said after a while. "Just." He nodded south. She followed his gaze. The horizon was hedgerows and fields, and at its edge the dark line of trees that was the beginning of someone else's park. 3.5 miles, he said. Do you spend most of the year there? Nearly all of it. He was looking south with the expression he had when he spoke of his estate, attached and burdened simultaneously, and aware of both. It requires attention. That's a careful word. He looked at her. Most of my words are. He paused. You've said that before. It continues to be true. What word would you use? She thought about it. I'd use the word you chose not to. He was quiet. And what do you think that was? I think, she said, that it requires you, not just attention, that the distinction matters to you and you've learned to compress it into a word that doesn't show that. He looked at the south horizon for a long moment. The wind at this height moved his coat and her bonnet ribbons and the last few leaves from the birch trees below. That is, he said slowly, the most precise thing anyone has said to me in some time. He turned toward her. Why do you do that? Do what? Say the precise thing. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his version of being open. Most people say the agreeable thing, or the safe thing, or the thing they've calculated will land well. You say what's accurate. The others take so much maintenance, she said, and they always come apart eventually. The accurate version holds. He was quiet for a moment that had something in it. Not decision, but the approach of one. I find, he said carefully, that I have become extremely poor at trusting my own read on people. 2 years of being poor at it. He looked at her directly. You make me want to try again. I am not sure what to do with that. She held his gaze. Below, Mrs. Allerton said something to Miss Stowe and they both laughed. You could try anyway, she said, and correct for error later. That requires a tolerance for being wrong, he said. Everyone is wrong sometimes. Not about everything at once. He said it lightly, but she heard the weight of it. When I am wrong about a person, I discover I have been wrong about every exchange I thought I understood. It revises backward. A pause. That is an unpleasant experience. Yes, she said. I can imagine it would be. She meant it. She thought about what it would cost a man of his precision to find that precision had failed him. Not just the wound of it, but the epistemological problem. How do you know what you know afterward? The other possibility, she said, is that you were not wrong, that your read was accurate, and the problem was the person rather than the reading. He looked at her. She could see him turning this over, examining it from the angle she had offered, checking it for structural soundness. That requires trusting the read, he said. Yes, she said, it does. Farley called something from the far parapet. The moment opened and dispersed into the general party, and Clara's voice rose from below with the news of tea and apples, and the younger Miss Rutherford headed for the stairs with enthusiasm. The Duke looked at Nora for a moment that was slightly longer than required. I'll consider it, he said. That's all I suggested, she said. They descended the Folly stairs, he ahead, she following, and she watched the back of his coat and thought that consider was not the word she had expected, and was probably more promising than the word she had expected, which was nothing, because she had not expected him to say anything at all, and the fact of his saying it mattered more than the word itself, and she was paying more attention to this than she had intended to be paying, and she needed to stop. She stepped out into the October air and went in for tea. Clara found her that evening at the edge of the drawing room, in the moment before the general noise rose past the point where a quiet conversation was possible. She appeared with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this moment and has decided it has arrived. He asked Farley about you, Clara said, quietly. Not an accusation, information. I know, Nora said. What you read, whether you came to London. Clara looked into her tea. Whether you had, I believe the phrase was, particular attachments elsewhere. Nora was quiet. And Farley told him to ask you himself, Clara said, which he won't immediately because he doesn't do anything immediately. She paused. But he will. Clara? Nora looked at her oldest friend, at the brightness she was not entirely concealing. What exactly did you intend when you invited me? Clara's expression did something complicated and resolved itself into honesty. I intended for you to have a restful fortnight, she said, and I intended for 2 people I'm very fond of to be in the same house for long enough to talk to each other properly. She paused. I did not intend any specific outcome. I want to be clear about that. You arranged the breakfast table. I arranged the breakfast table, Clara agreed. That's all. She looked across the room to where the Duke was speaking to Colonel Rutherford with the patience of a man doing a genuine small kindness. He's been careful for a very long time, Nora. Long enough that careful has started to look like his actual disposition, and it isn't. It's just what he's been using. She paused. I thought you might be the sort of company where he could put it down for a bit. Nora followed her gaze. The Colonel was gesticulating. The Duke was nodding with the quality she had been watching all week. Not absent, not managing, present, but rationing. Being there without being unguarded, holding the balance of it. And is he? She asked, putting it down. Watch his face when he thinks no one's looking, Clara said simply. She moved away toward Mrs. Rutherford, taking her tea and her discretion with her. Nora looked at the room, at the fire and the cards and the general comfortable noise of a house party, finding its ease. Across the room, the Duke finished with the Colonel and glanced up, not toward her initially, just scanning the room with the habitual awareness of a man who always knows where the exits are. Then he found her. His expression didn't change, neither did hers. But they had both looked, and the room was not so large that either of them could pretend they hadn't, and the distance between noticing and doing something about it was the distance that mattered now. She finished her tea. She found her chair. The evening went on around her with its ordinary warmth, and she let it and did not pursue the thought. But she did not quite release it either. The second week at Aldermere had a different quality from the first. The first week was discovery, the tentative mapping of who occupied which room at which hour, whose conversation repaid pursuit and whose required management, where the drafts came from, and which chairs were placed too close to them. The second week was something else. The house party had settled into its own internal logic, the way any collection of people does when they have been together long enough to stop performing and start simply being. The Allertons found their preferred spots and occupied them without apology. Farley became, by general consensus, the person you sought when an afternoon needed rescuing. Miss Stowe and the younger Miss Rutherford had found a mutual interest in watercolour and spent their mornings at the south windows with their paint boxes, talking in the easy way of women who have discovered they are more similar than their introductions suggested. The Duke came to Aldermere on Tuesday, on Thursday, and again on Saturday with the stated purpose of returning a book to Pemford and the actual effect of staying until 7. On Tuesday, he was in the library when Nora arrived. On Thursday, she was there first. On Saturday, they arrived within minutes of each other, and neither of them commented on the coincidence, which was its own kind of comment. What happened in the library across those 3 visits was this. They talked about books, which became talking about ideas, which became something that could not be reduced to either. They disagreed about Cervantes, specifically about whether Don Quixote's tragedy was that he believed too much or that the world around him believed too little, and the argument was genuine, reaching no resolution, and they both knew it was not about Cervantes by the second exchange. He was sharper in the library than anywhere else, less rationed, less managed. She thought this was probably because the library was the one room in the house where neither of them was performing for anyone. She found this dangerous in a way she did not examine at length. Outside the library, the week moved through its ordinary pleasures. On Wednesday, the weather was fine enough for the proposed excursion to the village, 8 of them in 2 carriages, a morning among the shops and the church and the excellent bakery that Clara had been mentioning since October. Nora found herself in the second carriage with Farley and the younger Miss Rutherford, and the Duke was in the first with Clara and the Allertons, and she noted the separation and decided it was good, and spent the carriage ride arguing with herself about whether she was right. She was not right. She had been hoping he would be in the second carriage. This was information she filed without pleasure. On Friday it rained again, and the house contracted to its indoor arrangements, and she was in the sitting room writing when Clara came in with the particular expression she reserved for ideas she was about to implement. "The musicale," Clara said. "No," said Nora. "Just one piece." "Clara." "The Clementi," Clara said. "You know the Clementi. You've played it since you were 17. "I play it adequately," Nora said. "In the company of Miss Rutherford, adequate becomes visible by contrast, which would be unkind." "Miss Rutherford plays beautifully," Clara said with the serenity of someone who has already decided how this conversation ends. "Her beauty and your adequacy We'll sit perfectly well together. Please, Nora." Nora looked at her oldest friend. At the 15 years of evidence that resistance was rarely worth the subsequent management. "One piece," she said. The music room held 14 people arranged in chairs near the instrument, with the informal proximity of a small group that does not require a stage. Mrs. Allerton had claimed a chair near the window. The Colonel was holding court beside the fireplace. Nora found a seat at the edge of the assembled group, near the door, with the clear intention of being audience rather than participant for as long as possible. The younger Miss Rutherford played first and played well. A Haydn sonata, with the clean precision of someone properly trained and genuinely fond of the music. The Colonel played next, with the authority of a man who had once played very well and believed this to be still the case. Then one of the Pemfords' neighbours performed a Scottish air with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and then Clara looked at Nora with the expression that settled it. She played the Clementi. It was, she knew this, had always known it, better than adequate. She had a good ear and a natural sense of phrasing, and she had played this particular sonata often enough to give it what it required, which was certainty rather than brilliance. She did not watch the room while she played, she never did. When she finished and stood and turned, she found the Duke watching her from across the room with an expression she had not seen before. It was not the managed one. It was not the complicated one. It was simpler and for that reason more arresting. The expression of a man who has seen something he was not prepared for and has not yet had time to arrange his face around it. He arranged it within a moment, but she had the moment before. And he found her afterward at the window, when the room had dissolved into tea and conversation, and the arrangement of chairs being moved back. She was looking west, toward the elm trees, and she heard him come to stand beside her, rather than saw it. "You didn't tell me you played," he said. "You didn't ask." "I'm asking now." "Now you've already heard," she said. "The question is somewhat redundant." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant—" He stopped. The pause that preceded his honest sentences. "You play the way you argue, as though you know what you mean, and you're not asking anyone's permission to mean it." She kept her eyes on the elm trees. "Is that unusual?" "In my experience," he said, "yes." He moved to stand properly beside her rather than slightly behind her, so that they were both facing the window, both ostensibly looking at the same grey October afternoon. "Most people play for the room. You played for the piece." "The piece is what there is to play," she said. "The room will make of it what they like regardless of what I do." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then, I find that disposition," the honest stop, the slight readjustment. "Rare," he said, not the word he had started with. "A careful word," she said. "You've said that before." "It continues to be true." She glanced at him. "What word did you start with?" He looked at her with an expression that was the first stage of the real smile, not the managed acknowledgement she had been cataloguing, but the thing beneath it, which he had seen only twice, and which changed his face entirely. "Something less careful," he said. She looked back at the window. The elm trees were motionless in the flat afternoon light. Behind them in the room, the Colonel was describing something to Mr. Pemford that involved considerable arm movement. Miss Stowe was speaking with Mrs. Allerton. Farley was watching Nora and the Duke from across the room, with the specific expression of a man who has placed a quiet wager with himself and is monitoring the outcome. "May I ask you something directly?" the Duke said. She turned to face him. "You may." "Why are you here?" He met her eyes. "At Aldermere, I know you're Clara's guest. I know you've been before. I mean, what did you come for? What were you hoping to find?" She understood the question. She understood more specifically what was underneath the question, the angle he had been looking for and had not found, and the decision he had now made to ask rather than continue looking. It was a significant step for a man of his particular caution, and she was not going to meet it with anything less than what he had given. "Clara asked me," she said. "I had nothing else that needed doing in October that could not wait. I like Aldermere." She paused. "And I needed somewhere to be that was not Hertfordshire." "Why not Hertfordshire?" She chose what to give him and gave it. "My father has a property that costs more than it earns. He has opinions about what might resolve it. The opinions are of the usual variety, and the autumn has felt like a long negotiation with a conclusion I keep declining to reach." She paused. "Being here has been a relief from that negotiation. That is the honest version of why I came." He was watching her with the quiet attention she had learned to read as his form of openness, the look he gave things he was actually weighing. "Do you intend to reach the conclusion eventually?" he asked. "I intend to reach an honest version of it," she said, "which may or may not be the one my father has in mind." He was quiet for a moment. She had given him the information and had not watched his face while she gave it, so she was reading him now, the careful expression, the internal processing behind it. He was not, she thought, alarmed. He was listening. "And what would an honest version look like?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the difficulty." He looked at her steadily. "Thank you," he said. She met his eyes. "For what?" "For answering directly when you could have deflected." He held her gaze. "I asked a question I had no particular right to ask. You answered it as though I had." He paused. "I'm grateful for it." The thing she had been holding in her chest for 2 weeks pressed briefly against its container. She turned back toward the room, where Clara was distributing tea with the warmth of a woman presiding over something she has arranged very carefully. "You should be careful," she said, the same words she had used on the morning walk, weeks and a different person ago. Saying things like that. "So you've said that before." His voice was lower, meant only for her. "That continues to be true." She kept her eyes on the room. "It makes it difficult to hold the appropriate amount of distance." He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him again. He was watching her with an expression she was going to need an entirely new category for. "Miss Elwood," he said. "Nora." The first time he had used her name. She had not been ready for what it would do. "I think—" "Miss Elwood," Clara's voice bright and unavoidable from across the room. "We're settling the question of the North Walk before the light goes. You must have a view." Nora turned toward the room. She kept her expression entirely ordinary. "The North Walk," she said. "The light's best from there at this hour." She moved away from the window without looking at him again. She heard him, a beat later, move in the opposite direction. The drawing room reassembled itself around her, and she accepted a cup of tea from a passing tray, and was composed by the time anyone addressed her directly, which was what composure was for. She did not look at him again until dinner. At dinner she did look twice. Both times he was engaged elsewhere, the second time he was not. That evening after dinner, Farley appeared beside her within minutes of the drawing room assembling, with the expression of a man who has a specific errand and intends to complete it efficiently. "He almost said something," Farley said. "I know," she said. "This afternoon at the window." "I know." Farley was quiet for a moment. He had the quality she had come to value. He thought before he spoke, and what he said was what he meant. "He's been different this week," he said, "since Tuesday in the library. He's less watchful. That's the word. He's been watchful for 2 years, and this week he is less so." He paused. "He won't tell me what you talk about in there." "Books," she said. "Yes, and I discuss the weather when I am not answering a question." He did not say this with any edge. "Miss Elwood, I will tell you plainly because I think you're a person who prefers plain. I have been his closest friend for over a decade. I know the difference between Caldwell being interested in someone and Caldwell being interested in a person. The first is social. The second is rarer." He glanced across the room to where the Duke was listening to Mr. Pemford with the ease of a man on familiar ground. "He is interested in you as a person. I am telling you because I think you should know it, and because I suspect you are doing him the courtesy of not presuming to know it yourself." She looked at him, at the honest face and the genuine affection underneath the assessment. "You're very loyal to him," she said. "I am," Farley said simply, "which is why I'm here talking to you instead of minding my own business, which he would vastly prefer." He raised his glass toward the Duke, who caught it from across the room and returned the gesture with an expression that was fond and suspicious in equal measure. "Excuse me, I'm about to be questioned about this conversation." He went. The Duke looked at Nora once, briefly, without expression, or with an expression too quick to read, before Farley reached him. She held it for exactly as long as she needed to, and then turned away. She looked at the third shelf of the library in her mind, at the book she had been holding in the window seat on the first afternoon, which she had replaced before leaving, which she had been in the habit of replacing ever since, putting herself back where she'd found herself, making the room look as though she hadn't been there. She thought about what that habit cost, and whether it was worth the cost. She had not decided by the time the evening ended. The third week arrived with the particular feeling of finality that all third weeks carry. Not announced, but present in the way the Allertons began mentioning their journey home, and the Rutherfords started speaking of winter improvements to their own house, the way the conversations began to acquire a retrospective quality, as though the party were already becoming something that was being looked back at. Miss Stowe announced on Monday that she would leave Friday rather than Thursday, citing a cousin's engagement in Surrey. She said it without any particular weight, but met Nora's eyes briefly across the breakfast table as she said it, and Nora understood. The house party had not been what it was arranged to be for Miss Stowe. It had been other things, some of them unexpectedly good. The mornings with the watercolours, the friendship with the younger Miss Rutherford, but not what it was arranged to be, and she was leaving with a day of grace rather than the last day, and that was its own kind of answer. Nora was staying through Thursday. That was 5 more days. The number was both insufficient and complicated, which she had stopped pretending not to notice. What she was managing by the beginning of the 3rd week was this. She had come to Aldermere with no design and had accumulated, in spite of herself, something that felt very much like one. Not a scheme. She remained on inspection without one, but a preference that had strengthened into the sort of thing that needed somewhere to go, and she did not yet know where it was going, and not knowing was its own particular discomfort. The Duke came to Aldermere on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of the 3rd week. Monday was the general company, dinner, cards, the Colonel's latest campaign recollection, the usual. Tuesday he was in the library when she arrived. He looked up and said nothing, and they read for an hour and then talked about the Battle of the Sheep. They had both now reached it, and agreed that it was both devastating and comic, without resolving which of those it was more, which was the same argument they had been having since the 1st week, and which Nora had concluded they would probably never settle, and had further concluded she did not particularly want to settle, because settling it would end the argument. Wednesday was the afternoon in the garden. It had not been planned. She had gone out after luncheon because the light was good, and she had been indoors since morning, and her mind needed weather. She took the kitchen garden path because it was sheltered, and she knew it. The Duke was at the gate when she arrived. He had ridden over for the morning. She had seen him briefly before luncheon, in conversation with Pemford about something to do with the tenant farms, and had apparently not yet left. He had the look of a man who had also needed weather, and had found the same path. "Miss Elwood," he said. "Your Grace," she nodded at the gate. "Were you going in or out?" "I hadn't decided," he said. She considered the kitchen garden, which was orderly and quiet and smelled of late cabbages and turned earth. "In," she said. "The light is better." "Then in," he said, and opened the gate. They walked the length of the kitchen garden in the companionable way that had taken 2.5 weeks to arrive at, without negotiating it, without either of them making a decision to be comfortable. She looked at the last of the autumn growth, the cabbages in their rows, the herbs cut back to stubs, the kitchen garden at the end of its useful season and very fine about it. He walked beside her with his hands behind his back and looked at the same things. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said. On Friday." She looked at the cabbages. "Which part?" "That you do not yet know what an honest resolution would look like." He paused. "I find I have been thinking about it since." And I think," he said, "that honest resolutions are more difficult to reach than dishonest ones, which is why so many people decline to attempt them. Dishonest resolutions have the advantage of being legible in advance." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're getting because you've been told what you're getting, and the telling is a kind of contract. Whereas honest ones," she said, "require you to find out." "Yes," he glanced at her. "Which requires tolerating uncertainty, which requires trusting something you cannot verify in advance." "That's a very precise description of a problem," she said. "I have been sitting with the problem," he said, "for some time." She looked at him. He was watching the end of the garden path with the expression of a man approaching something he has decided to approach. "Is this still about resolutions in the abstract?" she asked. "No," he said, "I don't think it is." The path turned at the end of the kitchen garden into a narrower walk along the wall where the espaliered pear trees had been trained in their patient rows. The fruit was long gone. The branches made flat geometric patterns against the old brick, bare and precise. "There is something I need to tell you," she said. He stopped. She stopped beside him. The decision to tell him had arrived without announcement. She had been not deciding it for 3 weeks, and she had run out of road. The continued not telling was itself a choice, and she had made the choice originally from a reasonable instinct, and had been making it since from something else, something less clean, and she could see it clearly now. "On the first afternoon," she said, "before dinner I was in the library." He was very still. "I had gone in for quiet. I had arrived that afternoon. I had been in the carriage since 9. I needed somewhere to be that wasn't the drawing room." She kept her voice level. "I was in the window seat. I had the curtain drawn. I did not hear you come in until you were already speaking, and by then—" She paused. "By then I had left it too late to say anything without making it worse, and I made the wrong decision. And I stayed still." He was looking at her. His expression was not readable. She continued. "I heard what you said to Farley, all of it." She held his gaze. "I would sooner marry a stranger, the acreage, the whole of it." The pear branches made their flat patterns on the wall. Somewhere on the other side of the garden, a door opened and closed. Neither of them moved. "That evening," she said, "I was introduced to you. And I said nothing. And I have said nothing for 3 weeks, which was, I made a choice, and I am aware that it looks like management, and I want to be able to tell you that it was not, and I need you to understand why I am not certain that is entirely true." He spoke for the first time. "Go on," he said, quiet, not cold. "I stayed in the window seat because I had left it too late to do otherwise." She kept her voice plain and direct. "But I did not say anything at dinner because you had said something honest in a room you believed was empty, and it was the most honest thing I had heard anyone say in the particular mode that I had been living in, and I found I did not want to be the person who made you regret saying it." She paused. "And then we talked, and the conversations they were not managed, they were simply what they were. And every day I did not tell you, the decision compounded, and I told myself that the compounding was because the right moment had not arrived, but the truth is that I was afraid." "Of what?" His voice was still quiet. "That if I told you, you would look for the angle." She met his eyes directly. "You have been looking for the angle since the first morning. I did not want to give you a reason to look harder. I did not want everything that had actually happened between us to be revisited." She paused. "That is the honest version. It was not only protection of what we had, it was also protection of myself. And I am aware that protecting myself by withholding something you had a right to know is not a virtue, whatever it looked like." He was quiet for a long time. She held the silence and did not fill it. "You were in the library," he said finally. Not a question, he was placing it. When Farley and I—" "Yes." "You heard all of it." "Yes." He turned away from her toward the pear trees and stood looking at the flat branches against the brick. She watched his back and did not speak, and gave him the silence to do what he needed with it. "I said," he said slowly to the pear trees, "that I would sooner marry a stranger than be managed into a decision by a house party." A pause. "And then I was introduced to you, and you knew that, and you—" He stopped. Every conversation, the morning walk, the library. He turned back. The Cervantes. "All of it real," she said. "None of it managed. I want you to be able to believe that." "Can you tell me," he said carefully, "why, when you heard what I said, you did not simply leave before I finished? You could have slipped out." "Yes," she said, "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She thought about the window seat, the elm trees, the Virgil in her lap, the voice she had not expected to hear saying something she had not expected anyone to say aloud. "Because," she said, "you said mechanism. That is the word you used for what you did not want to be. And I had used that word myself in my own head that same afternoon about my own situation." She held his gaze. "I heard someone name the thing I was in the middle of, and I could not make myself move." He looked at her. The expression was still not fully readable. She was watching the layers of it, the rapid internal processing she had learned to recognize. He was not angry. He was doing what he did with every significant thing, which was take it apart carefully and examine the components before he put it back together. "The word is accurate," he said, "for what I was describing." "Yes," she said. "And for your situation?" "Yes." "And you told me on Friday that your father has a property that costs more than it earns," he said, "and opinions about a resolution, and I want to ask you directly, did you come to Aldermere with any intention, any thought, however distant, of me as that resolution?" This was the question. She had known it was coming, and she had prepared an honest answer, and she gave it. "No," she said, "I came to Aldermere because Clara asked me, and I needed somewhere to be that was not Hertfordshire. I did not know you would be here as often as you were. I did not know what you were like. She paused. I had heard of the Duke of Caldwell. The man in the library was not what I expected, and the man in the library is what I have been talking to, and the man in the library is who I... She stopped. Who you what? He said. She looked at him. The careful word or the true one. She had been choosing the careful word for 3 weeks, and she was standing in a kitchen garden in October, and she was tired of the careful word. Who I find I am not indifferent to, she said, which I did not plan, which is, I think, more verifiable than any planned thing would be. But I am aware that you cannot simply take my word for it. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, the book. She looked at him. In the library, he said. The first afternoon you replaced it before you left. She did not say anything. I noticed it had been moved, he said. The following week, the Virgil on the 3rd shelf, I assumed it had been displaced and I put it back. He looked at her with the clear expression, the one she had no prior name for. And then on Thursday, when you were in the library, I was reading it. You came in and we spoke, and you looked at the shelf, and then you looked at me, and I could not read your expression, and I have been trying to read it since. A pause. Now I understand what it was. She thought about that Thursday, the moment of finding him with the Virgil, the careful management of her face, the conversation they had had about something else entirely. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. He said it without hesitation. She looked at him. You're not angry. No. He said it with the simplicity of a man who has examined the question and returned a verdict. I was, for the first moment, when you began to speak, I was bracing for something I have been braced against for 2 years. He paused. And then you kept speaking. And it was not what I have been braced against. It was someone telling me an uncomfortable truth, because they had decided the truth mattered more than the discomfort. He looked at her steadily. I know the difference. She held his gaze. The kitchen garden was very still around them, the pear branches making their patient patterns, the October air clean and cold. Do you? She said. Yes, he said. I have learned it at some cost, but I know it. She exhaled. She had not realized she had been holding it, the breath. I was afraid you wouldn't, she said. I know you were. He looked at her with the expression that she now understood was simply his face when he was not managing it. That is... He stopped. The honest stop. That is itself a kind of evidence, he said. That you were afraid. Because you wouldn't have been afraid if it didn't matter whether I believed you. She looked at him, at the precise, careful man who had taken apart what she'd given him and found the structure of it. That's very exact, she said. It's your own argument, he said. The accurate version holds. You said that in the library. He paused. I have been thinking about it since. She looked at the pear trees, at the flat branches and the old brick and the pewter sky above the garden wall. She thought about 3 weeks of conversations and the word mechanism, and the library on the first afternoon, and the small particular shock of hearing someone tell the truth in a room they believed was empty. I need to say one more thing, she said. Say it. My father's situation, the property, the resolution he wants, I am not going to pretend it doesn't exist. It exists. It will continue to exist, regardless of anything else. She held his gaze. And I want to say something about the word you used in the library. Stranger. I am not a stranger in the sense you meant. I grew up in Hertfordshire. I have heard your name and your title discussed in drawing rooms since I was 17. I knew the acreage before I knew your face. She paused. I want you to know that I know that. I'm not going to ask you to pretend I arrived without information. He was quiet for a moment. What are you asking me to consider, then? Whether the information was the thing, she said. Whether knowing the name made me want the man. Because it did not. The name is what everyone in that drawing room knows. The man is different. And I cannot prove that to you, but I thought you should know that I see the distinction, and I am not asking you to overlook it. He looked at her for a long time. No, he said. She looked at him. No, he said again, not harshly. With the precision of a man who has thought about this before she raised it. I have spent 2 years testing for that particular contamination. I know what it looks like, and I know what this looks like, and they are not the same. He held her gaze. Your father's situation is your father's situation. What I think of you is what I think of you. I am capable of holding both, without letting the second be explained by the first. She was quiet. Unless, he said, you are telling me that what you feel is explained by the first, that it is the first. No, she said. Then we agree, he said, that it isn't. She looked at him, at the man who was watching her with the clear expression and not blinking and not retreating. She thought about what it took for a man who had retrained himself not to trust his own reading of people, to stand in a kitchen garden and say, we agree, with that particular steadiness. I find, she said, that I have not been able to look for the angle in you either. I tried in the first week. I tried to find the thing that would make you more manageable. Did you find it? No, she said. Good, he said. He closed the distance between them. Not quickly, nothing urgent about it. No sense that he hadn't considered every step. He stopped in front of her at a distance that was not appropriate for general conversation and looked at her with the expression that was simply his face. And then he took her hand, which was not gloved. She had come out without gloves, in the thoughtless way of someone who had gone out for weather rather than company, and held it with a deliberateness that was characteristic of him, and which she had come to understand as the way he touched anything he meant. I would like very much, he said, to know you for the rest of my life. If you are willing, if you would do me the honor of marrying me, I would not waste it. She looked at him, at the careful sentence and the uncautious meaning inside it, at the man who had spent 2 years learning to be careful and had just chosen, in a kitchen garden in October, to be something else. Yes, she said. He looked at her. You're certain? I am a direct person, she said. You knew this. I did, he said. I find I'm grateful for it. He did something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The real smile, the full one, the one that changed his face entirely and which she had only seen twice before and which remained, on both previous occasions, and on this one, entirely arresting. You're very efficient, he said. I've told you, she said. Evasion takes too much maintenance. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it with the same deliberateness, the gesture saying what the careful words hadn't quite, or saying it again in a register that left less room for interpretation. The kitchen garden stood around them in its orderly autumn bareness, the cabbages in their rows, the pear trees in their patterns, the old brick wall holding all of it. She was cold from the air and the walk, and he was warm, and there was a very simple solution to the distance between those two facts. He found it. She did not object. The kiss was deliberate, not urgent, not tentative, with the quality of a decision fully made. She had not been planning for it, which meant she had no management prepared, which meant that what she felt was simply what she felt, which was in some ways easier and in other ways more. When he lifted his head, he looked at her with the clear expression and did not say anything. Neither did she. The kitchen garden was very still. We should go in, she said eventually, before Clara sends out a search party. Clara, he said, knows exactly where we are. Yes, Nora said. She arranged it. He laughed, a real laugh, brief and genuine, the first she had heard from him, and she filed it immediately in a category with the real smile, the category of things she had not expected and was going to keep. She did, he agreed. They went in. The elm trees stood in their rows behind them, and the kitchen garden went back to its quiet business, and the afternoon did not appear to have noticed anything particular had occurred in it, which was the great advantage of October afternoons. Caldwell in February was a house that knew what it was. Nora had grown up in a house that made excuses for itself. The Hertfordshire property, her father's pride and anxiety both, always under small repair, always apologizing in the way of houses that want to be grander than they are. She had spent 24 Februaries understanding its logic, its drafts, the particular creak of the east stair, the way the morning room was cold until 11, regardless of how early the fire was laid. A house has a character, and the character of her father's house was aspiration combined with apology. Caldwell did not apologize. This was the first thing she had understood about it, arriving in December as its new mistress, which was a title she was still wearing in the careful way of a garment that fits correctly but has not yet been broken in. The estate was large. She had known this from maps and from his descriptions, which were precise and unsentimental, but knowing the scale of a thing and inhabiting it were entirely different enterprises. The park was larger than her imagination had given it. The homewood, visible from the library window on clear days, was at its best in February, the bare branches making dark lacework against the pale sky. The kitchen garden was already planning its spring, the gardeners moving through it with the purposeful look of people who had not stopped thinking about it all winter. She had been at Caldwell for 2 months. The months had been. She turned the word over as she turned all words over, looking for the honest one. Good was accurate and thin. Surprising was accurate and slightly unfair to him because she had not gone in without information. The honest word was actual, which was the best word she had for things that turned out to be more solid than their description, things that hold weight when you put weight on them. He was, on his own estate, a different version of the Aldermere version, more fully himself, which was not a contradiction. At Aldermere he had been a frequent guest, which was comfortable and familiar, but was not the same as home. At Caldwell he moved through the rooms with the ease of a man who has managed a place for long enough that the management has become instinct rather than effort. He knew which floors were uneven, and which windows stuck, and which tenant had been feuding with which neighbour for the last 6 years, and why. His steward respected him in the way that cannot be performed, that is only the residue of being consistently trustworthy across a long span of time. They disagreed openly when they disagreed and without residue. He was funnier at home than in company. This had taken her approximately 1 week to establish, and had continued to be established daily since. The dry edge she had caught in fragments at Aldermere was, in the library at Caldwell at 9 in the morning with coffee, considerably less dry and considerably more present, a wit that did not perform, that emerged only when he was comfortable enough not to manage it, which was when they were alone. She found this a privilege she had not been told to expect, and did not take lightly. They argued, not badly, not with the quality of arguments that leave residue, but with the genuine friction of two people who had spent long enough developing their own views that they could not pretend to share everyone. He had strong opinions about the management of the South Fields. She had strong opinions about the correspondence system, which had been accumulating in a logic she found impenetrable and had reorganized in a logic she found self-evident. He had examined her reorganization with the expression he gave significant things, the serious considering one, and had then adopted it entirely and without comment, which she had decided to take as the highest form of agreement. She had written to Clara in January, "I find the days very full, which I did not expect. I expected a large house to feel empty. It does not. I suspect this is because its inhabitants have strong opinions about almost everything and express them, which I find more companionable than quiet agreement would be." Clara had written back, "I told you he was very good. I accept no form of credit except the form of credit that is your acknowledgement that I was right." Nora had written, "You were right. I will not say it again." Clara had written, "You just said it again." The correspondence had been continuing in this vein for 2 months, and Nora found she had not been so entertained by a set of letters since they were at school. The morning she found the book, she came downstairs before him. This was unremarkable. She was an earlier riser by a consistent half-hour, which she spent in the library with coffee and whatever she was reading, and he arrived at the threshold some time thereafter with the expression of a man who had agreed to be a morning person and found the agreement mostly worth making. She had come to regard this expression as one of the better things she had encountered in 24 years of existence, and she had not told him this on the grounds that he would become self-conscious about it, and the self-conscious version would be less good. She took her chair, the one near the east window, which caught the morning light before the other chairs did, and reached for the book she had left on the side table the previous evening. The book was not there. She checked the table. She checked the other table. She looked at the shelf she sometimes left things on when she had been in the middle of something and been interrupted. She looked at the window seat. There was a book on the window seat. She stood and crossed the room and picked it up. The Virgil, the translation, the third shelf volume from Aldermere's library. She stood with it in her hands and did not immediately think anything, because the thought required a moment to arrange itself. She looked at the shelf it had come from, not the third shelf, not eye level, but a lower shelf on the east wall, beside a copy of Theocritus and a brown volume on Roman agriculture. He had put it there. In the section of shelves she had learned, in 2 months, was where he kept the books he returned to. She heard him in the corridor. The particular quality of his footsteps, which she had not consciously catalogued and could nonetheless place without thinking, a piece of information that had been accumulating since December without requiring her to pay attention to it, simply entering the way all the information about a person enters when you share a house with them. She was holding the Virgil when he came in. He saw her at the window. He saw what she was holding. His expression moved through something brief and arrived at the clear one, not startled, not self-conscious, the expression of a man who has done something intentional and is encountering the moment of its being known, and finds the moment acceptable. He came into the room and closed the door. "You moved it," she said. "Yes." It was Clara's. She looked at the book in her hands, at the worn cover, the familiar weight. "It belongs to Aldemir's library." "I wrote to Clara in December," he said. "I asked if I might have it. She replied by return post. She was—" He paused. "She said she would send it immediately, and that she was very pleased to have been asked, and that she hoped I would give her regards to you. And then there were 4 additional lines about how she had known from the first week that things would—" He stopped. The letter was characteristic. Nora looked at him. "What did you tell her you wanted it for?" He crossed to his chair, the second chair across from hers, and stood beside it in the way he had when he was having a conversation he intended to have properly rather than in passing. "The truth," he said, "that it was a book I wanted in my library." She looked at the shelf where he had placed it, the Theocritus, the brown agricultural volume, the Virgil between them. "You put it with the books you returned to," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer. She could see that he knew the answer and was deciding how to give it. "Because," he said, "on the afternoon I first came into that library and found you were already there, or had been, and the curtain was drawn and I did not know, I picked up the Virgil from the 3rd shelf, and I read it. Not for Virgil." He held her gaze. "I read it because you had had it in your hands during the hour that changed how the whole autumn developed, and I wanted to know what sort of afternoon that was. For you." He paused. "The book was in your hands. I thought it might tell me something." She stood very still with the Virgil and thought about that Thursday in the 2nd week, the afternoon she had walked into the library and found him with a book she couldn't see the title of, the careful management of her face, the conversation they had conducted afterward, about something else entirely, the relief when he did not ask her directly what she was thinking. "Did it," she asked, "tell you something?" He looked at her across the morning library. The 2 chairs, the east window, the fire that had been laid before either of them came down. "It told me," he said, "that it was a quiet afternoon in which a careful person heard something she hadn't expected and made a decision that cost her, for weeks afterward, the ability to simply be where she was." He paused. "It told me that the decision was made by someone who found honesty more natural than strategy, but had ended up, through a sequence of small, understandable steps, in a position that looked like the opposite." He looked at the book in her hands. "And it told me that whoever replaced it on the shelf before she left the room was someone who wanted very much to leave no trace of having been there. Which is not what a strategist does." He held her gaze. "A strategist stays visible." She looked at him, at the precise, patient man who had read the Virgil to understand her afternoon, who had asked Clara for the book, who had placed it where he placed the things he returned to. She thought about the window seat in October, the curtain drawn, the voice she had not expected, and the elm trees through the glass, and the decision she had made without knowing she was making it, which was to stay still and listen to someone tell the truth. "James," she said. She had been careful with his name at first. It was new after a month of your grace and an engagement during which he was simply he, and she was still careful with it, using it when it was the right word and not otherwise. "Yes," he said. She crossed the room and placed the Virgil back on the shelf where he had put it, the east wall, the lower shelf, beside the Theocritus. She straightened it so the spine aligned with its neighbors. She stood for a moment with her hand on the spine. "It goes here," she said, "since this is apparently where it lives now." She turned. He was watching her with the clear expression and the real smile, the full one, the one that had changed his face entirely every time she had seen it, and continued on this occasion to do the same. She had told herself she would get used to it. She had not got used to it. She had concluded that not getting used to it was the correct outcome. She came back and sat in her chair. "The coffee," she said. "Yes," he said, and went to the door and called for it with the ease of a man in his own house, which was what he was. She opened her book. She looked at the page without reading it for a moment, in the way she had looked at the Virgil in October without reading it, with a mind occupied by something that required no text. The fire was good. The east window had the particular quality of February light that was thin and clear and honest, which was the best kind. He came back and sat in his chair. The coffee arrived. The morning began its ordinary business. "Where are you?" he asked after a while. He meant the book. The Battle of the Sheep, she said. He looked up from his own book. She did not meet his eyes immediately. She let him look and let the moment sit. And then she looked up, and he had the full smile, and she had not got used to it, and she was not going to. "Read me the passage," he said. She found it and read it to him, the Shelton which he had been right about, which he did not remind her of because he was not that kind of man. Outside the window, the February morning did its thin, clear work on the Caldwell Park and the home wood, and the kitchen garden was planning its spring, and the Virgil sat on its shelf between the Theocritus and the book about Roman agriculture, doing what it had always been doing, which was holding a particular afternoon still so that it could be returned to. She finished the passage and set the book down. He was looking out the window with the expression he had when he was turning something over, the serious, considering one. And she watched him do it, which was one of the better things about the mornings. "Well," she said. "Comic and devastating," he said, simultaneously. "I told you," she said. "How you did," he agreed. "I find that is quite often true." She looked at him. He was looking at her now with the clear expression, which was simply his face when he was not managing it, which was every morning in this library, and most evenings and certain particular moments scattered through the days, moments she had stopped trying to predict and had started simply waiting for, because they arrived more reliably than predicted things and were better for the waiting. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They went back to their books. Outside, the February light did what February light does, thin, clear and steadily, without apology, becoming March.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.